very excited to be part of this very interesting project, and I look forward to not only sharing my own experience and expertise, but also to learn from all of those involved, and many of whom are here this evening. Uh, I will share some perspectives from my more than 30 years of experience in both researching Palestinian refugees and their rights and working with UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, which I left a year and a half ago. And in line with the focus of the Ithaca project, I will talk briefly about the critical role of archives for Palestinian refugees, and then about some ethical issues related to UNRWA and Palestinian refugees. So let me start with the critical role of archives for refugees and especially also for Palestinian refugees. And I believe that the more protracted a refugee situation become, the more important it is that the refugee experience is documented in forms that can both be operationally relevant for historical claims, relevant for research, and so forth. The Palestinian refugee situation has underscored this. You know, it's the most protracted refugee question since the Second World War. More than 70 years after the original flight of the refugees, there is still no political settlement in sight, and a political settlement is today further away than at any time since the start of the refugee question. So in that context, UNRWA has gradually recognized the critical importance of its archives and taken measures to preserve and to digitize them. And this is not so widely known to researchers, so I just give you a few quick overview. UNRWA maintains so-called family files and refugee registration data. Family files are the documents that refugees have contributed, going all the way back to pre-1948 Palestine, family birth documents, other marriage certificates, property documents, and this has become over the years a very rich archive. It currently contains 330,000 individual files, which include the details of over 1 million refugee families, and which contain over 40 million documents in total, as I said, dating back to pre-1948 Palestine. UNRWA recognizing the critical importance both for the refugees' sort of historic claims, as well as for the agency's operation, and as well as for research purposes, UNRWA undertook a major project to scan those original family files in a multi-year project conducted in the 2000s. And currently all these documents have been electronically preserved and been entered into a major database. Now that database is not easily accessible, and there have been shortcomings with the registration system that accompanies it. And UNRWA is currently once again embarking on a major project to modernize the registration system, which will, amongst other things, include the introduction of individual registration card to sort of move away from a family-based registration to individual registration, as well as the introduction and building an introduction of a refugee portal through which all refugees can access their data. They can provide credentials to the agency, on the basis of which they will be provided with access parameters. So that's the archives on the refugees. Then UNRWA has over the years also collected a huge collection of audiovisual material on the Palestinian refugees. And in 2009, this archive was inscribed in the UNESCO Memory of the World Register. It contains, and it's now digitized. It has been digitized in the second half of the 2000s and continuing until approximately 2015. And it contains 430,000 negatives, 10,000 prints, 85,000 slides, and the film archive contains 75 films and more than 730 video cassettes. So very rich archive. And there is also an online platform through which it can be accessed. And the agency is still working on processing the metadata for all the various negatives and slides. Then there is a third archive that is less well known and is created by the what was initially the sister body and even the parent body of UNRWA, the United Nations Conciliation Commission for Palestine, which was created in late 1948 after the establishment of the State of Israel and the outbreak of war between Israel and the neighboring states, as an attempt to bring about a resolution of the conflict, including the refugee issue. And the United Nations Conciliation Commission established a refugee office, which between 1950 and 1965 documented all the individual properties and components of properties left behind by Palestinians in pre-1948 Palestine, up to the level of individual trees and communal properties and even assets of refugees, etc. This very rich archive was sort of, when the Conciliation Commission became defunct in the mid-1960s, this very rich archive was stored in UNRWA, in UN headquarters in New York. In the 1960s and 70s, it was preserved through microfilm and has later been digitized. And over the last decade, the Institute for Palestine Studies has been building a database based on that data, which once again is an incredibly rich resource, both for research and for the purpose of claims. And there is the potential to link this database with the UNRWA, with the updated and modernized UNRWA registration records. And both agencies, IPS and UNRWA, already in discussion to make sure that as they move forward, the potential for linkages is fully explored. So that in relation to these various archives, anybody who is interested in it, you're very welcome to contact me offline, and I'm happy to point you to the right people where you can obtain more information and where that is possible access. Then very quickly, a couple of ethical issues in relation to also the Palestinian refugee question and UNRWA, and they apply, I believe, in a broader context as well. So if we talk about ethical issues in relation to a refugee population, in relation to an organization like UNRWA, there are different ways of sort of looking at it, and there are many ethical dimensions. there are those that are related to the organization, to the organization's personnel, and to the beneficiaries the organization serves, and more generally the affected population that it deals with. This includes standards of conduct of personnel vis-a-vis their relationship with the organization, the relationship of the humanitarian personnel with beneficiaries and affected populations, the relationship between humanitarian personnel in the office amongst co-workers. For these, for both the implementation of those standards of conduct and to support staff when they have concerns in relation to those standards or to the potential violation of those standards, UN agencies and many other organizations, as well as the national public and private sector, have established sort of ethics functions that exist by different names. In the UN context, they're referred to as an ethics office, and then there is a separate ombudsman's or ombudsperson's office that deals with workplace conflict. I have in UNRWA had the privilege to set up the UNRWA ethics office and headed that for my last decade with the agency. If any of you are interested in that, please feel free to reach out to me. Organizations have also established, similar to universities and others doing sort of research or being involved in research, a research review board, and UNRWA is no exception. It took quite a long time for the agency to establish a research review board, and it's only over the last couple of years that the agency has been taking sort of research ethics and mainstreamed it. And then there is sort of a fourth area related to ethics in the organizational setting, and that is sort of the ethics of the individual program. UNRWA is a huge provider of education and primary healthcare services, so it applies sort of, you know, the ethics of the substantive programmatic areas in relation to the service delivery. For medical services, it abides by WHO standards. For its educational work, it complies with the standards set by UNESCO and so forth. So that's sort of on the organizational level. But as was also discussed in the discussion earlier today and also yesterday, ethics is not just about sort of the organization and the processes and the personnel. It's also an issue that cuts across, you know, in many different aspects of a refugee operation, and even of the representation of refugees. And just to mention a few points in relation to the UNRWA example. One can argue that UNRWA was born in original sin, in the sense that UNRWA's establishment provided a contradiction between the promotion of return and voluntary repatriation as sort of the preferred solution for the Palestinian refugee question, as set out in UN General Assembly Resolution 194 of December 48, and a year later in the resolution establishing UNRWA, much more focus on local integration and resettlement. And that friction, in a way, that contradiction between return on the one hand and local integration and resettlement on the other, has been one of the key factors in the fact that after 7 decades, the refugee issue is still existing. And I can elaborate on that, and we extensively discuss this in the new edition of the book that Matteo mentioned, Palestinian Refugees and International Law. Then there is another major ethical consideration in relation to UNRWA's funding model, the way the agency is financed, which is primarily through voluntary contributions. And one can argue that for an organization whose mandate has evolved in providing basic education and primary healthcare services with a human rights-based eligibility, a voluntary funding model is not suitable. Any national education system and primary healthcare system needs to grow as a function, the budget needs to grow as a function of inflation and population growth. And there's not a single voluntary funded agency that can keep up with such a steep rise in financial requirements. And that has meant that UNRWA has sort of struggled with financial crisis almost from the mid 1950s onwards up till this very moment. And again, I can talk much more about it, but I'm conscious of the time. One can also argue that there are ethical considerations with respect to UNRWA's current mission. UNRWA defines itself as an organization that is providing services to the refugees, and that increasingly has also engaged in protection, but that does not look for or is not engaged in the quest for durable solutions. And with that sort of reality, or with that interpretation of the agency's mandate from sort of the 1960s onwards, the Palestinian refugees are the only category of forced displaced without an institution working towards durable solutions. And this leaves the sort of the Palestinian refugees and the involvement of the international community to sort of managing the refugee situation without any serious work towards a resolution, keeping refugees in a refugee status in perpetuum, so to speak. And finally, more generally, not so limited to UNRWA, there are ethical concerns with respect to representation, or rather misrepresentation, of Palestinian refugees as a result of misunderstanding about the distinct regime for Palestinian refugees under the 1951 conventions. There is quite frequently the perception that they're not real refugees, that they're in a way children of a lesser God. And for those Palestinians outside sort of UNRWA's area of operation, and by now, and in our book, we discuss that Palestinian refugees have moved to all corners of the globe. More than 50 countries are included in the survey in our book. Statistical invisibility of Palestinian refugees outside the MENA region, because the asylum authorities don't know how to categorize them. Are they stateless? Are they coming from the state of Palestine? What is the status of Palestine? And so they're often lumped together with refugees from Syria, as Syrians, as Libyans, as Lebanese, and so forth. So there's very often they fall off the radar statistically